The black Genesis SUV cut the wheel hard toward the flooded curb outside Hyundai Marina, and its driver was smiling before the water even left the ground. In the passenger seat, Nam Ga-en already had her phone up, filming. A wall of grey rainwater rose off the puddle in slow motion, catching the afternoon light for just long enough to look almost beautiful, before it slammed into the woman walking alone along the promenade, soaking her from the knees up, running down a cream silk blouse she'd bought for a client dinner an hour earlier and now would never wear again. Ga-eun burst out laughing. Baek So-jun, hands still on the wheel, laughed with her. Because the drenched woman on the sidewalk wasn't a stranger to him. She was Simone Dane, the ex-wife he had humiliated, cheated on, and discarded after she'd helped him turn a single warehouse lease into Baek Construction Group. Pedestrians froze. A delivery driver lowered his scooter kickstand just to stare. Nobody moved to help, and nobody recognized the drenched foreigner they'd just watched get run down in broad daylight. What none of them knew, not the pedestrians, not Ga-eun filming for her followers, not So-jun grinning behind tinted glass, was that in 48 hours, this exact video would detonate the $10 billion Hyundai resort deal So-jun needed to keep his company from going under. It would also end something else nobody in that car had accounted for. Ga-seun's own carefully built name. Why didn't Simone fight back? What did her ex-husband not know about the life she'd built since Busan swallowed her whole? And what was Ga-seun about to lose that had nothing to do with him at all? Tell me in the comments, if someone did this to you in public, what would you do? And if you're here for stories about betrayal that comes back around, subscribe, because this one's just getting started. Simone Dane was 29 years old, and she did not scream. She stood there, dripping on Marine City Promenade, mud running off her sleeve onto the leather folder she'd been carrying to a pitch meeting, and she simply closed her eyes for 1 second, breathed, and picked the folder back up off the wet pavement. "Are you all right?" an older woman asked in halting English, hand half raised like she wasn't sure if touching a stranger's shoulder was allowed. "I'll be fine," Simone said. "Thank you." She kept walking, heels striking wet concrete, spine straight, folder held against her ruined blouse, like she still had somewhere important to be, which she did. The walk back toward the hotel took 11 minutes, and Simone spent every one of them doing the thing she'd trained herself to do since the divorce, separating the feeling from the moment causing it. The feeling was old. It had been sitting in her chest since a lawyer's conference table 3 years earlier, and today's puddle had only knocked the dust off it. The moment itself, though, was new, and moments, unlike feelings, could be managed. She catalogued it the way she'd once catalogued load calculations. One SUV, one license plate she'd caught out of the corner of her eye without meaning to, one laugh she'd recognize anywhere because she'd had to listen to variations of it for 8 years. By the time she reached the hotel's revolving door, she'd already decided, consciously, that she wasn't going to give either of them the satisfaction of a reaction beyond what a stranger's mud puddle deserved. She had no idea yet that the reaction the situation actually deserved was already being assembled 2 hours north by a man who hadn't even heard about it yet. 3 years earlier, this would have broken her completely. Not anymore. Simone had grown up in Sacramento, the only daughter of a hospice nurse and a machinist who'd rebuilt small block engines out of the garage on weekends to cover the mortgage. She learned 2 things at that kitchen table before she learned algebra: that comfort was never guaranteed, and that you built what you wanted with your hands, or you didn't get it at all. At 22, she finished a design degree at Sacramento State with 2 part-time jobs and a stack of student loans. And at 24, she won a hospitality design fellowship that placed her in Busan for 18 months, working on interiors for coastal resort projects. She'd told her mother on the phone the night before her flight, I'm going to figure out how buildings make people feel safe. And then, I'm going to build the kind that make women like us feel like we belong in them. She had no idea, boarding that plane, that she'd spend the first 4 years of that mission funding someone else's name on the building instead of her own. She met Bak Se-jun at a groundbreaking ceremony for a Haesundae mixed-use tower, back when he was a mid-level project manager at his family's small construction firm. Sharp-jawed, quick with numbers, quicker with compliments, and hungry in a way she mistook, at 25, for ambition worth marrying. When Baek Construction's bank turned down financing for their first major bid 8 months later, it was Simone who sold the small Haeundae studio her fellowship stipend had let her buy, wired the proceeds straight into his company account, and slept on a cot in the site office through 2 monsoon seasons, keeping the books straight while subcontractors screamed for payment. She learned to read a balance sheet, the way she'd once learned to read a floor plan. She learned to negotiate land leases in a language she was still only half fluent in. Back then, Seo-jun told every investor who'd listen, there is no Baek Construction without Simone. He said it in interviews. He said it standing at their wedding with a glass of champagne raised, in front of both families, telling a banquet hall full of people that his American wife had risked more for his company than his own blood had. That she'd sold jewelry that had crossed an ocean in her grandmother's suitcase to bet on a man half of Busan had told her not to marry. His mother had cried. His father, a quiet man who ran a noodle shop near Nampodong his whole life, had shaken Simone's hand with both of his and said, in careful English he'd clearly practiced, "You gave him what money can't buy." Simone kept that sentence for years, long after everyone in that banquet hall had learned to pretend they'd never heard any of it said at all. Money changed that sentence fast. Within 4 years, the company had grown into one of Busan's fastest rising builders, and Seo-jun grew with it. A cliffside house above Haeundae Beach, a rotating stable of imported cars, membership at a private golf club that quietly didn't extend invitations to Korean-American wives, and eventually stopped extending much of anything to Simone at all. He stopped bringing her to investor dinners, telling her once, not gently, that she read wrong, in a room full of old money faces. He started correcting the way she dressed in front of his colleagues, in Korean, assuming the compliment-shaped insult would go over her head. It didn't. She'd understood Korean well enough by then to catalogue every small cruelty in real time and say nothing, because saying something had stopped working 2 years earlier. Then came Nam Ga-eun. Ga-eun was 26 when she met Seo-jun, the youngest daughter of a Busan shipping logistics family with old money and a newer appetite for relevance. She'd grown up watching her 2 older brothers absorb the family business and the family attention in equal measure. Report cards pinned to the refrigerator, seats reserved at every board dinner from the time they were teenagers, while she was steered toward marrying well, the way other daughters in her circle were steered toward law school. At 15, she'd asked her father if she could join the shipping insurance division, the way her brothers had, and he'd laughed, not unkindly, and told her the business needed her to be presentable more than it needed her to be useful. She never asked again. She found her own kind of leverage instead, an app, a face made for it, and a following that hit 400,000 by the time she turned 24, built entirely on borrowed rooms, resort suites gifted for a tag, designer bags on loan for a weekend, a life staged to look owned rather than rented. It worked, mostly. Brand deals paid her rent, which her father liked to remind her at dinner she technically didn't need to worry about, a comment that landed every time like the small, precise cut it was meant to be. She'd watched enough of her friends in the same industry get quietly dropped the moment their numbers dipped, to know the whole arrangement sat on a foundation with no name on the deed. Nothing like her brother's guaranteed board seats. Nothing that couldn't disappear in a single bad quarter. Seo-jun, married, established, flush with a company that had his family's actual name on actual buildings, Looked like the first permanent thing she'd ever been offered that didn't come with her father's condescension attached. She told herself falling for a married man was a plot twist, not a character flaw. She told herself a lot of things, most of them small enough to swallow one at a time. Simone found the hotel charges first, then the messages, then photographs she wished she hadn't opened on a work laptop in front of two junior architects. What broke her wasn't the affair. She'd suspected for months by then. It was the conversation across the lawyer's conference table the day the divorce was finalized. 8 years, she'd said, sliding the pen back across the table after her signature. I want you to at least tell me the truth about what changed. Se-Sejun hadn't looked up from his phone. He'd answered her in Korean, low and fast, clearly assuming 8 years of marriage hadn't been enough for her to catch every word of it. You were useful when we had nothing. I don't need useful anymore. She understood every syllable. She said nothing back, signed the last page, and walked out of that office, without giving him the reaction he seemed to be waiting for. It was, she'd realize much later, the first time in years she'd taken something away from him, instead of the other way around. She left Busan within the month. She did not, however, leave Korea, and that decision would turn out to be the only strategically sound thing left standing in the wreckage of that year. Simone rebuilt 2 hours south, taking on hospitality interior consulting for coastal developments recovering from a bad wildfire season. Small contracts at first, the kind that paid rent and nothing else. The Tuesday before the mud, in fact, she'd spent 4 hours in a windowless conference room in Yangsan, walking a table of skeptical developers through a lobby redesign for a mid-size resort whose fire-damaged wing she'd been hired to reimagine. One of the developers, an older man who'd clearly assumed the American consultant would defer to his opinion on load calculations, pushed back hard on her framing plan 20 minutes in. This won't hold the weight of the reception desk you've specified, he said, tapping the drawing. Simone didn't flinch. She pulled up the structural engineer's report she'd already had run against the exact configuration, walked him through the beam spacing line by line, in Korean good enough that nobody in the room offered to translate for her, and watched him go quiet somewhere around the third citation. By the end of the meeting, he'd signed off on every page. Nobody in that room knew her last name was about to be Yeom. They just knew she was the only person at the table who'd actually done the math. That was the version of herself she'd built in 3 years, without anyone financing it for her. Not a fellowship stipend, not a husband's company account, not a rich man's name. It was the version standing on Marine City Promenade an hour later, when a wall of muddy water hit her from the knees up, and it was the reason she didn't scream. It was on one of those projects, a fire-damaged Hanokok restoration outside Yangsan, run by a non-profit trying to save 3 centuries-old buildings before the next storm season finished what the fire started, that she met a man in work gloves, repairing a fence alongside the rest of the volunteer crew, giving no name but Dae-hyun. For months, that was all she knew him as, a quiet man who remembered which volunteers took their coffee black and which took it with too much sugar. A man who showed up before anyone else on site and left after the last truck had gone. One afternoon, 6 months into the restoration, a support beam they'd spent 2 weeks reinforcing came loose under an unexpected load test, and Simone was the first one to spot the hairline crack running up its face before it became a real problem. She was on her knees in the dirt, tracing it with a flashlight, when Dae-hyun crouched down beside her, uninvited, and asked what she thought had caused it. Moisture got into the joint before the last restoration, she said, not looking up. Someone patched it instead of replacing it. It's been rotting from the inside for probably a decade. So the outside looked fine, he said, and the inside was already failing. That's usually how it goes, she said. And something in the way she said it made him go quiet in a way she'd later realize wasn't about the beam at all. He asked her questions about load-bearing joinery in traditional roof framing after that, sitting on an overturned bucket while she worked, and actually listened to the answers instead of waiting for his turn to talk, which was, Simone would later admit to her sister on the phone, the single most romantic thing anyone had done for her in almost a decade. He never once mentioned what he did for a living. She never once asked, assuming, reasonably, given the state of his work boots, that whatever it was, it didn't pay especially well. She learned much later, from a non-profit board member, not from him, that Yeom Dae-hyun ran Yeom Global Holdings, one of the largest privately held investment groups in the country, with resort, marina, and mixed-use holdings stretching from Busan to Jeju to the Gulf Coast of the United States. He'd lost his first wife young, to a sudden illness that the Korean business press had covered with the kind of intrusive sympathy that made him retreat from public life almost entirely afterward. He kept exactly one photograph of her on his desk and no others anywhere else in the house, and it took Simone the better part of a year to understand that wasn't erasure, it was protection, the same instinct that had kept his second courtship almost entirely off the internet. When she confronted him about it, not angry, just tired of learning things about him secondhand, he told her simply, "I didn't want you deciding anything about me before you'd decided something about the man fixing your fence." It was, she realized, the exact opposite of everything Seo-jun had ever offered her, which had always come with the receipt attached. 2 years after the fence, they married quietly at his family's property outside Yangsan. 22 guests, a ceremony under a canopy of persimmon trees his grandfather had planted decades earlier. No press, no live stream, nothing for anyone to screenshot. Simone wore her grandmother's earrings, the one piece of jewelry she'd refused to sell even during the leanest year with Seo-jun, and when Dae-hyun saw them at the altar, he didn't ask what they were, he simply reached up and touched one gently before the ceremony started, as if he already understood exactly what it had cost her to keep them. Almost no one in Busan's business circles knew that the American woman who'd once mortgaged that same jewelry to fund a construction startup was now Mrs. Yeom, wife of one of the most powerful investors on the peninsula. Certainly Seo-jun didn't. Certainly Ga-eun didn't either, though within 48 hours, she'd wish very badly that she had. Simone walked into the lobby of the Hyundai Grand, still soaked through, mud drying stiff along one sleeve, drawing stares from the concierge desk, when a driver in a dark suit intercepted her before she reached the elevators. "Mrs. Yeom," he said, bowing slightly, unbothered by the state of her. "Mr. Yeom asked me to bring you home immediately." 2 hotel guests near the front desk exchanged looks. Simone nodded, some of the tension finally leaving her shoulders, now that no one who mattered could see it happen. "Thank you, Mr. Ju." Neither of them noticed a guest by the concierge desk quietly lifting her phone to take a photo, not of the mud, but of the name the driver had used. The drive back to Yangsan took just under 2 hours, and Mr. Ju said almost nothing the entire way, which Simone appreciated more than any sympathy he might have offered instead. By the time the car pulled through the gate, the household staff had already laid out a robe and a pot of ginger tea, without being asked, the quiet competence of people who'd learned, over 2 years, to read a bad day off her posture before she said a word about it. She showered, changed, and sat at the kitchen island, staring at nothing in particular, for almost 20 minutes before her phone buzzed with the first message from a colleague asking, carefully, if she'd seen what was going around online. She hadn't yet. She would, within the hour, understand exactly what that meant. Across town, in a private dining room, with a view of Gwangali Bridge, lit up gold against the evening water, Seo-jun and Ga-eun were celebrating. Beck Construction was 2 days from signing the Hyundai Marina Resort contract, $10 billion that would bury every overdue loan, every furious subcontractor, every whispered rumor that the company was quietly cash-starved. Seo-jun raised a glass of soju. "After Thursday," he said, "nobody questions me again." "And after Thursday," Ga-eun said, tapping her glass against his, "nobody questions me either." She meant it more literally than he understood. Two brand partners had gone quiet on renewal talks that month, citing engagement concerns that were really just a polite way of saying her numbers had plateaued and her scandal adjacency, always dating a married man, always one leak away from being the other woman in someone's divorce filing, had started to make risk-averse marketing teams nervous. She needed something to trend. She needed, badly, to be seen as the woman standing next to the man who just closed the biggest deal of the year, not the woman quietly waiting to see if he'd ever actually leave his wife the way he'd promised 3 separate times. So when she recognized the drenched woman from an old photo she'd once seen forwarded in a group chat, his ex, the American, the one who used to be somebody before she wasn't, something in Ga-eun had reached, without much thought at all, for the one weapon she'd always trusted, an audience. She told herself, in the half-second between recognizing Simone's face and lifting her phone, that this was harmless. A funny clip, nothing that would actually reach the woman herself, nothing that mattered beyond the next 24 hours of engagement. It was the same small, comfortable lie she'd been telling herself for 2 years about the married man in the driver's seat, and it worked on her exactly as well as it always had, which is to say, completely, right up until it didn't. She posted the video that night with the caption, "Some people just can't let go." Stay classy, and watch the likes climb for the first hour feeling, for the first time in months, powerful. By midnight, it had 3 million views, and not the kind she wanted. "Who does this to another human being?" read the top comment, in Korean and English both. A Busan lifestyle account with triple her following reposted it captioned only, "This you?" Somewhere above Yangsan, one particular viewer had already seen it, and the ground under Ga-eun's entire business model had already started, quietly, to crack. Dae-hyun was in his study when his assistant messaged him, "Sir, you need to see this." He watched the clip once, his jaw set. He watched his own wife get run down in the street and walk away without a word, chin up, folder in hand, the same composure she'd carried the night she first told him, 3 dates in, exactly what her first marriage had cost her, so there'd be no surprises later. He called downstairs immediately. Simone came in, wearing dry clothes, hair still damp from the shower. "You saw it," she said. "Not a question. Why didn't you call me?" "I didn't want to make it bigger than it was," she said quietly, sitting across from him. "I spent 3 years letting that man live in my head rent-free. I'm not giving him that kind of real estate again." Dae-hyun reached across and took her hands. "He may not have your heart anymore," he said, "but he still has consequences coming, and so does the woman filming." This is the part of Simone's story that still makes people in the comments furious 3 years later, and I want you to sit with it for a second before we keep going. She never asked for revenge. She got it anyway, because revenge, done right, isn't something you chase. It's something that catches up to people who never stopped running toward their own worst instincts. By morning, Dae-hyun had his legal and finance teams pull everything available on Back Construction Group, and what they found was worse than gossip. 2 loans already in technical default, quietly restructured twice to avoid tripping covenant clauses. Layoffs the company hadn't disclosed to its own board, dressed up in the annual report as workforce optimization. Subcontractors owed months of payment, 3 of whom had already quietly retained lawyers, one of whom had sent a demand letter Seo Jun's own general counsel had buried rather than escalated. And Beck Construction was one of 3 finalists for the Hyundai Marina Resort contract. The exact project Yoam Global Holdings was financing. The exact $10 billion Seo Jun had bragged about at dinner the night before, to a woman whose real last name he still didn't know. Dae-hyun's lead counsel, a sharp woman named Ji-yeon, who'd worked with him for a decade, laid the full file on his desk the next morning, thick enough that she'd needed both hands to carry it in. "Even without the video," she said, "this company shouldn't be signing anything. We found a change order on the marina's seawall specification that got quietly downgraded to cut costs 8 months ago, never disclosed to your engineering team. If that seawall fails during storm season, Yom Global Holdings' name is on the financing, not just theirs. The video just means we don't have to pretend otherwise for the sake of optics. Dae-hyun read the file twice, closed it, and said only, "Prepare everything for Thursday." That same morning, 3 of Beck Construction's board members convened an emergency call Seo-jun hadn't authorized, and, technically, couldn't stop. One of them, a soft-spoken finance director named Mr. O, who'd sat on the board since the company's 2nd year, back when it had been Simone's cot in the site office, keeping the ledgers straight, put it plainly to the other 2. "The video is a symptom," he said. "The disease is 2 years of loans we've been rolling over instead of paying down. If Yom Global Holdings pulls out of Thursday's signing for any reason, we don't have 90 days of runway left. We have maybe 30. "Does he know we're having this conversation?" the second board member asked. "No," Mr. O said. "And I'd rather he hear it from the bank than from us. It'll land the same either way, and at least this way, none of us has to watch his face when it does." Nobody on that call disagreed with him. Nobody called Seo-jun to tell him the call had happened either. Seo-jun, meanwhile, had no idea any of this was happening. In his glass-walled office overlooking Gwangali, he told his senior staff, arms spread like a man already accepting an award, "This contract fixes everything. Once we sign, the rest disappears." One of them hesitated, glancing at his phone before speaking. "Sir, the video. It's past 4 million views. 2 business reporters have called the front desk this morning." Seo-jun waved a hand. "It's the internet. People forget by next week." They weren't forgetting. Financial press had already named him by full name and title. A regional business daily ran a piece by lunchtime titled "Beck Construction CEO Under Fire After Viral Video," beside a still frame of the splash itself. And by evening, 2 competitor construction firms had quietly reposted it to their own corporate accounts, with captions dripping in false sympathy. 2 board members had quietly requested an emergency call that Seo-jun had, so far, managed to postpone. A labor rights account with a following in the low millions picked up the story from an entirely different angle, pairing the mud video against screenshots of the unpaid subcontractor complaints someone had leaked. Captioned simply, "Same company." The communications director, a woman who'd worked for Seo-jun for 6 years and had never once heard him apologize to anyone for anything, told the reporter only that the company does not comment on personal matters, a line that made the next day's headline write itself. Even Ga-eun, over dinner that night, pushed her food around her plate and said, "Maybe we take the video down." "Down doesn't undo 4 million views," Seo-jun said, not looking up from his phone. "In 48 hours, we're celebrating $10 billion. Nobody remembers a puddle after that." Privately, though, Seo-jun spent that same night working his phone harder than he let Ga-eun see, calling 2 smaller regional banks to quietly ask what it would take to secure bridge financing if Thursday's signing somehow fell through. A question he framed as routine due diligence, and which both bankers, politely, declined to answer in any detail, citing the current news cycle. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself the same thing 3 more times before he fell asleep. What he didn't know, what Ga-eun herself was only beginning to understand, was that her own phone had started buzzing with a different kind of message that night. Not fans, not comments. Her management agency, the small 3-person outfit that negotiated her brand deals, forwarding an email from Murray Cosmetics, the skincare line she'd been the face of for 2 years. "Given recent developments, we're pausing the Q3 renewal pending internal review." The Murray deal, in particular, had meant more to Ga-eun than the money ever did. She'd landed it 18 months earlier, after 3 rounds of pitch calls, the first brand partnership she'd won entirely on her own numbers, rather than through a family connection her father had quietly arranged, and she'd told her assistant at the time, only half joking, that it was the first thing in her adult life nobody could say her father had bought for her. She'd kept the signed contract PDF saved to her phone for months after, reopening it sometimes late at night, the way other people reread old text messages from someone they missed. Reading the pause email felt, in a very specific way, like watching that PDF quietly delete itself. She read it twice, said nothing to Seo-jun, and put her phone face down on the table. He had no idea the man funding his rescue deal already knew everything and had already decided. She had no idea her rescue deal, the one where being seen with a winning man made her look like a winner too, had already started collapsing from the other direction entirely. If you've made it this far, this is the part where I need you to sit with something for a second. Neither of them saw it coming, and both of them had 2 full days to change course, and didn't. Drop a comment if you've ever watched someone walk straight into a wall they refused to see. We're about to watch it happen, in real time. The next day, a second message arrived, this one for Ga Eun alone, and it would turn out to be the closest thing to an escape route she'd get. An unfamiliar number texted her a single line, "You don't know who she's married to. You have maybe 6 hours to fix your part of this before it's out of your hands." Attached was a single photograph, Simone, mud-streaked, being greeted by name as Mrs. Yum in the lobby of the Hyundai Grand. The same photo the curious hotel guest had taken the night before, now apparently circulating in exactly the wrong group chats. Ga-eun's stomach dropped, in a way it hadn't dropped in years. She knew the name Yom, the way everyone in Busan business circles knew it, not as gossip, but as gravity. She sat with the photo for 20 minutes before she did the one thing that might have saved some part of her reputation. She called Simone directly, using a number she'd gotten, badly, through a mutual contact who owed her a favor and would regret it later. "I think we should talk before this goes further," Ga-eun said, when Simone picked up. "There's not much to talk about," Simone said, calm, unhurried, the same voice she used walking skeptical developers through a load-bearing calculation. "I can take the post down," Ga-eun pressed on. "I can post something else, an apology, credit to you, whatever framing helps you. I just need you to tell people it was a misunderstanding, that we didn't know who you were." There it was, the real ask, buried under the offer. Not "I'm sorry for what I did to you. Help me control the story before it costs me anything." "You knew exactly who I was when you posted it," Simone said. "You didn't know my husband's name. Those are 2 very different kinds of not knowing, and only one of them is the part you actually regret." "That's not fair," Ga-eun said, and Simone almost laughed at how quickly fairness had become the priority. "None of this was ever about fair," Simone said. "It was about a woman who thought a puddle and a phone were free. They weren't." "Please," Ga-eun said, and for the first time, there was something under the polish that sounded almost like the 26-year-old she actually was, rather than the version of herself she'd built for an audience. "I have brand deals riding on this. My family already thinks I've embarrassed them enough. Then you should have thought about that before you filmed a woman getting drenched in the street for content," Simone said, not unkindly, which somehow made it land harder. "I'm not posting anything. I'm going to let this play out exactly the way it was always going to play out, because for the first time in 3 years, I don't have to lift a single finger to make sure the right people see who you both actually are." She hung up. Ga-eun sat alone in her apartment, phone in her lap, and understood, correctly, as it turned out, that she'd just spent her last available move. This is usually the part in these stories where I'd tell you to imagine what you'd do in Ga-eun's position. I'm not going to, because I think you already know the answer, and I think most of you would have done what Simone did instead. Nothing, and let the truth arrive on its own schedule. The signing was set for the grand ballroom of the Hyundai Grand 2 days later, chandeliers throwing gold light across white tablecloths, packed with bankers, attorneys, and investors gathered for the largest resort contract on Korea's southern coast that year. Seo-jun arrived in a tailored suit, certain the day would erase every crack the past week had opened in his company's foundation. Ga-eun adjusted her dress beside him, quieter than she'd been in months. Her phone, the same phone that had started all of this, sitting untouched in her clutch for the first time in years. "I told you it would work out," she said, though it came out sounding like she was trying to convince herself as much as him. "I've already won," Seo-jun said. Then the chairman stepped onto the small stage at the front of the ballroom, adjusting the microphone with the particular formality reserved for announcements everyone in the room was about to remember for a long time. "Before we proceed with the signing, our principal investor would like to address the room personally." The doors at the back opened. Every investor in the ballroom stood, chairs scraping in a ripple across the marble floor, the way rooms do automatically for the people who actually own the money in them. Yam Dae-hyun walked in, unhurried, and Seo-jun's confident smile disappeared before he'd even finished forcing it into place. "Mr. Yam," Seo-jun said, stepping forward with his hand out. "This is an honor." Dae-hyun raised a hand instead of taking it. "Before business, I'd like everyone in this room to watch something." Confused murmurs moved through the crowd. The giant screen at the front of the ballroom lit up. It was the video. The room watched in total silence as Seo-jun swerved deliberately through the flooded gutter and drenched a woman walking alone along the promenade, while beside him, Ga-eun laughed and filmed the entire thing on her phone. When it ended, nobody spoke. Seo-jun's face had gone the color of wet concrete. Ga-eun looked like she might actually be sick, one hand pressed flat against her stomach. "The woman in that video," Dae-hyun said, voice even, carrying easily across the silent room, "is my wife." Gasps moved through the ballroom like wind through a wheat field. "That's not possible," Seo-jun said, the words coming out thinner than he meant them to. 3 years ago, Dae-hyun continued, she rebuilt her life after someone she trusted decided she'd outlived her usefulness. She chose dignity over revenge. "I'm choosing something else." The doors at the back opened again. Simone walked in, composed, unhurried, wearing the kind of quiet authority that made every investor in that ballroom instinctively straighten in their seats. Every eye in the room finding her at once. Seo-jun could barely get the words out. "You're married to him?" Simone only nodded, close enough now to see, for the first time, real fear on his face. Not embarrassment, fear, the kind that understands exactly how much is about to be taken away. "Please," he said, voice cracking. "I made a mistake." Dae-hyun's voice didn't rise even slightly. "A mistake is an accident. What you did on that sidewalk was a choice, made twice. Once when you swerved the wheel, and once when you let her post it." He looked around the silent room, at the bankers and attorneys who'd spent the last 2 days pretending the video hadn't happened. UOM Global Holdings invests in people before it invests in projects. Character isn't a line item on a balance sheet until the day it costs you everything on it. Then, the line that would end up quoted in half the coverage that followed, Beck Construction Group, is withdrawn from consideration for the Haeundae Marina Resort contract, effective immediately. The contract went, within the week, to a smaller family-run builder with a 2-decade reputation for paying its subcontractors on time and never once appearing in a viral video for the wrong reasons. Several of the bankers who'd sat through the presentation quietly told colleagues afterward that they'd suspected something was wrong with Beck Construction's numbers for months, and simply hadn't had a reason strong enough to say so out loud until Dae-hyun handed them one on a screen. One investor, an older woman who ran a mid-size pension fund, reportedly turned to her associate on the way out of the ballroom and said only, "That's the fastest I've ever seen $10 billion decide it didn't want to be spent." Within 3 weeks, Seo-jun's banks pulled every line of emergency financing they'd extended on the strength of a deal that no longer existed. His board, already circling before the ballroom scene, voted him out of the company that still carried his own family's name on its letterhead. Mr. O was the one who called him with the vote's result, and the one who told him, not unkindly, that the board had authorized a severance package in recognition of founding contributions, the same phrase, Seo-jun would realize later, that had once been used to quietly push his own father out of a noodle shop lease decades earlier, before Seo-jun had ever had money enough to notice how that kind of language worked. He came into the glass-walled office one last time to collect what belonged to him personally, which turned out to be almost nothing. A framed photo from the groundbreaking ceremony where he'd met Simone, an award from a regional builders association, a box of business cards with a title that no longer applied. The staff who'd spent years telling him this contract fixes everything watched him carry the box to the elevator and said nothing, the way people do when they've already updated their opinion of someone and are just waiting for the paperwork to catch up. He kept the house above Haeundae Beach for exactly 4 more months, until a forced sale covered part of what the company owed its subcontractors. The same subcontractors Simone had once stayed up nights making sure got paid, back when she still believed staying up nights for him meant something. Gawon's ending arrived on a different, quieter timeline, but it arrived just as completely. Mare Cosmetics didn't renew, sending the same templated line about brand alignment that every dropped influencer in Busan had learned to recognize by heart. Neither did the resort chain that had comped her stays for 2 years. The rival account that had reposted the video with "This you?" kept posting updates on the fallout for weeks, gaining nearly 100,000 followers off the story, while Ga-eun's own numbers bled out in slow motion, unfollow by unfollow, each one a small, silent verdict from strangers who'd once paid, with attention if nothing else, to be told her life looked like something worth wanting. Her father called a family dinner 2 weeks after the ballroom story broke. Nationally, the kind of dinner in her family that was never actually about the food. Nobody touched the first course. Her older brother, who ran the logistics company's shipping insurance division, didn't bother softening it. "You knew he was married," he said, not as an accusation, just as a fact. He was tired of everyone pretending wasn't already public record. "You didn't have to film it. That part was yours." "I didn't know who she was," Ga-eun said, quieter than she meant to. "That's not the part anyone's angry about," her younger brother said, the first thing he'd said all night. "Nobody's angry you didn't do enough research. They're angry you thought it was funny." Her father, who had spent 2 years pretending not to know about a married man because pretending was easier than confronting a daughter he didn't know how to talk to, stopped pretending entirely that night and asked her, in front of both brothers, to take a step back from public life until this settles. The kind of request in her family that never actually came with an end date attached. Nobody argued with him. Ga-eun didn't either, which surprised her more than anything else that night. She moved out of the Haeundae apartment 3 of her sponsors had technically been subsidizing, and back into her parents' house in Dongnae within the month, 26 years old, 400,000 followers, and falling, spending her nights scrolling through comments that used to be adoring and now weren't, learning in real time what Simone had learned 3 years earlier in a much bigger way, that a life built on someone else's attention, or someone else's money, or someone else's name isn't actually a life you own. It's a loan, and loans get called exactly when you can least afford them. Months later, at a small charity gala in Yangsan, raising money for the same Hanok restoration project, where Simone had first met her husband, Seo-jun found himself face-to-face with her for the first time since the ballroom. He'd lost the company, most of the house, and, his mother had told him bluntly at Chuseok that year, setting down a bowl of songpyeon between them with more force than the moment required, most of the respect he'd spent a decade building. "Your father shook that woman's hand at your wedding and told her she'd given you something money couldn't buy," his mother said. "You spent every year since proving him wrong. I hope the 10 billion was worth it." He hadn't had an answer for her then, and he still didn't have one months later, standing across from Simone at the gala. He looked smaller than she remembered, not physically, just in the way people look, once the thing propping up their posture has actually been taken away. He apologized, really apologized, carefully, without excuses, for the first time in either of their lives together or apart. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. I just needed you to hear it once, without an audience. Simone looked at him, not unkindly. The mud and the ballroom and the 8 years before both of those things, sitting somewhere behind her eyes, but no longer running the show. You didn't lose everything over a puddle of water, Seo-jun, she said. You lost it the day you decided I'd stopped mattering. The water just happened to catch it on camera. She didn't mention Ga-eun. She didn't have to. By then, everyone in that room had already read the same headlines she had, watched the same follower count, fall the same slow way Seo-jun's board seats had. Dae-hyun found her a few minutes later, near the dessert table, 2 glasses of champagne in hand, and didn't ask what Seo-jun had said. He only asked, "Are you all right?" "I am," Simone said, and meant it, taking the glass from him. I think that's the last conversation I ever needed to have with him. It didn't even take very long. Good, Dae-hyun said, because the restoration committee wants your opinion on the East Wing roofline, and I already told them you'd say yes before they finished asking. You always do that, she said. Only when I already know the answer, he said, and led her back toward the fence they'd first met beside, 6 years and an entire other life ago. She walked back to his side, and Seo-jun finally understood something no signing bonus was ever going to fix, and something Ga-eun was learning in a bedroom in Dongnae at exactly the same time, in her own way. The people and the audiences you use on your way up are exactly the ones who remember you on your way down. Character was never the soft, sentimental thing either of them had assumed it was while they were busy being cruel. It was the only currency that never lost its exchange rate. If this story hit different, you already know why. Subscribe for more, and tell me below. Was Ga-eun as much to blame as Seo-jun, or did she just get caught in someone else's fall? I want to hear where you land.